In open water, calm surfaces can fracture without warning, when immense shapes surge upward and routines collapse instantly. Panic replaces precision as speed, weight, and instinct collide beneath the waves. From family dives gone wrong to solitary inspections turning desperate, the danger escalates fast. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters, clearly told, fully explored, and brought to a close. The southern coast of Australia has long been a prime location for shark cage diving, with its nutrient-rich waters attracting great whites from hundreds of miles away. In December 2025, the waters off Port Lincoln were particularly active, with several operators reporting increased sightings of large predators cruising the continental shelf. The region's reputation as a hotspot for marine wildlife had made it both a tourist attraction and a place of respect for those who understood the power of the ocean's apex predators. Mark Harrington had spent 43 years avoiding deep water. As a civil engineer from Adelaide, he preferred the predictability of concrete and steel to the chaotic mystery of the sea. His wife, Elise, a pediatric nurse with 15 years of experience, had always been the adventurous one, dragging him to rock-climbing walls and hiking trails. Their children had inherited her boldness. Noah, 19, was preparing applications for marine science programs and had been pestering his parents about a cage dive for 2 years. Clara, 16, simply wanted to prove she was braver than her older brother. The family reunion had been Elise's idea. Mark's brother had flown in from Perth and her sister had driven up from Melbourne. But Mark wanted something special for just the 4 of them before the chaos of extended family descended. When Noah suggested the cage dive, Mark surprised everyone by agreeing. He figured it was time to face the fear that had kept him on beaches while his family snorkeled. They booked with a veteran operator who had been running dives for over 20 years without incident. The vessel was solid, the crew experienced, and the safety briefing thorough. Mark listened intently as the dive master explained the steel cage's construction, the breakaway mechanisms, and the communication system. Everything had redundancies. Everything had been tested thousands of times. The morning of December 12th arrived with unusual calm. The sea lay flat and glassy, reflecting the pale blue sky. Visibility was reported at over 30 meters, conditions the crew called perfect. Mark felt his stomach tighten as they motored out to the dive site, but Elise squeezed his hand, and Noah kept grinning at him with that infectious enthusiasm only teenagers possessed. The cage was lowered smoothly into the water, its white-painted bars stark against the deep blue. Mark went in first with Noah, while Elise and Clara waited for their turn. The crew began dispersing the bait, a mixture of fish parts and tuna oil that created a slick on the surface. Within minutes, the first shark appeared. It was enormous. The crew estimated 17 feet, possibly more, with a girth that suggested a mature female. She moved with the confidence of an animal that had never encountered a threat. Noah pointed excitedly through the bars as she glided past, her black eye rolling back as she investigated the cage. Mark felt his heart hammering, but also a strange exhilaration. The creature was beautiful in a terrible way. The shark made several lazy circles, her movements economical and purposeful. Then something changed. Her trajectory shifted. Instead of circling, she began to accelerate, her tail beating harder. The crew shouted something Mark could not hear over the rush of bubbles from his regulator. The impact was catastrophic. The shark hit the cage at full speed, her snout striking the corner joint with the force of a small car. The entire structure twisted violently, throwing Mark and Noah against the bars. Metal groaned and shrieked underwater. Before anyone could react, the shark reversed and struck again, this time from below, her massive head driving upward into the cage floor. The welded corner joint, which had held for thousands of dives, buckled inward. The bars bent at angles they were never designed to achieve. Water pressure forced the damaged section to collapse further. Mark felt something strike his chest with tremendous force. Noah's regulator was ripped from his mouth. On deck, the crew reacted with trained precision. The winch operator immediately began hauling the cage upward while others prepared emergency equipment. But the damage was already done. The deformed cage jammed against the winch line, making retrieval agonizingly slow. Elise and Clara, who had been preparing to enter the water for their turn, watched in horror from the deck as the twisted cage slowly broke the surface. Emergency services were contacted while the crew worked frantically to extract the occupants. Mark was unconscious, his chest crushed by the impact. Noah had drowned after losing his air supply and being unable to reach the surface of the flooded cage. The tragedy deepened when the crew found themselves in an impossible situation. The shark, still agitated by the vibrations and commotion, remained in the area, circling aggressively near the vessel. Elise, overcome with shock and grief at witnessing her husband and son's deaths, attempted to jump into the water toward the damaged cage. Clara, trying to restrain her mother, was pulled overboard in the struggle. When crew members and rescue divers entered the water to retrieve them, the predator made several violent passes. Its behavior abnormally aggressive, possibly triggered by stress or territorial response to the vessel's presence in the blood in the water. The chaos, the trauma, and the catastrophic failure of safety systems that had worked flawlessly for decades created a perfect storm of tragedy. Despite the crew's desperate efforts, both Elise and Clara sustained fatal injuries from the shark attack before they could be pulled from the water. By the time the situation was contained, all 4 members of the Harrington family were dead. Investigators later determined that the cage's structural failure was caused by a microscopic stress fracture in the welded joint, undetectable during routine inspections but catastrophic under extreme force. The shark's unusually aggressive behavior became a subject of ongoing marine biology research. The incident sent shockwaves through the diving industry. Several operators suspended cage dives pending investigation. The crew, traumatized and guilt-stricken despite following all protocols, struggled to process what had happened. Mark's fear of deep water had been justified in the worst possible way, and a family's attempt to create a memory together had ended in unthinkable loss. The coast of Western Australia had been a kiteboarding paradise for decades, with Coral Bay serving as one of the premier destinations for the sport. The shallow turquoise waters stretched for miles, offering perfect conditions for both beginners and professionals. In March 2019, the area was experiencing an unusual influx of baitfish, driven inshore by warmer currents and creating spectacular feeding frenzies that attracted predators from deeper waters. Sophie Bennett had been kiteboarding professionally for 8 years. At 31, she had competed in international championships and made a comfortable living through sponsorships and instruction. She had traveled to Coral Bay specifically for the wind conditions, which in late summer could produce sustained gusts, perfect for high-speed runs and aerial maneuvers. The morning of March 14th promised excellent conditions, with steady 15-knot winds and crystal-clear visibility. Sophie launched from the beach just after 9 in the morning, her kite snapping taut as she accelerated across the shallows. The water was barely 4 feet deep in places, warm and inviting. Schools of baitfish moved in dense clouds near the reef line, their silver bodies flashing in the sunlight. She had seen them earlier and made a mental note to stay clear, knowing that baitfish attracted larger predators, but the wind pushed her trajectory toward the schools than she had planned. She was executing a series of jumps, using the kite's lift to propel herself several feet above the water when she noticed the disturbance. The baitfish scattered explosively, creating a circular gap in their formation. Sophie's instincts told her to change course, but she was committed to her landing trajectory. The tiger shark came from deeper water near the reef edge, surging upward with startling speed. It measured approximately 12 feet, its distinctive stripes visible even through the spray. The shark struck the edge of Sophie's board just as she touched down, its jaws clamping onto the fiberglass and sending her tumbling sideways. The impact threw the spray high into the air, and Sophie felt the board torn from her feet. She surfaced immediately, her kite still pulling her forward, but now without the board to maintain direction. The shark circled back, its dorsal fin cutting through the shallow water in a tight arc. Sophie grabbed the kite's control bar and used it to stay upright, her feet desperately searching for the sandy bottom. The water was too deep. On the second pass, the shark brushed against her leg, its rough skin scraping through the neoprene of her wetsuit. Sophie jabbed downward with the control bar, striking the water and creating splashes. The shark veered slightly but did not retreat. Its movements were deliberate and curious, the behavior of a predator investigating potential prey. 2 instructors on paddleboards had been working with students about 50 meters away. They saw the commotion and immediately paddled toward Sophie, shouting and slapping their boards against the water. The noise and movement created confusion for the shark, which circled wider, trying to assess the multiple threats. One instructor threw his tow rope toward Sophie, calling for her to grab it. She lunged for it while keeping her eyes on the shark's position. The predator made another pass, closer this time, its snout nearly touching her outstretched arm. Sophie kicked violently, her training overriding her panic. The shark's eye rolled back as it turned away. The instructors created a barrier between Sophie and the shark, their boards forming a visual obstacle while they continued making noise. For several agonizing minutes, the standoff continued. The tiger shark circled but seemed increasingly uncertain, its curiosity waning as the multiple targets became more aggressive. Finally, the shark turned toward deeper water, its tail beating steadily as it moved past the reef line and disappeared into the blue. The instructors hauled Sophie onto one of the paddleboards, her legs shaking uncontrollably. Her wetsuit was torn on her left leg, revealing scratches from the shark's skin but no serious wounds. Bruises were already forming on her hip and shoulder from the initial impact. They paddled back to shore quickly, constantly scanning the water behind them. Sophie reached the beach and collapsed onto the sand, adrenaline draining from her system. Her board was later recovered, bearing deep tooth marks along one edge. The incident reinforced what marine experts had been warning about for years. Fast-moving water sports in areas with active baitfish schools could trigger curiosity-driven investigations from tiger sharks, even without blood or traditional prey signals in the water. Sophie recovered physically within weeks, but found herself hesitating before entering the water for months afterward. The coastal waters near Gansbaai, South Africa, had earned the nickname Great White Shark Capital of the World through decades of consistent predator activity. The region's unique geography created ideal hunting conditions, with deep channels running close to rocky shorelines and seal colonies providing abundant prey. In August 2017, the area was experiencing peak shark season, with multiple large great whites documented by local research teams patrolling the waters daily. Liam Foster had built a modest following documenting extreme sports across 3 continents. At 28, the British adventurer had jumped from bridges in New Zealand, scaled rock faces in Peru, and surfed massive swells off Hawaii. His personal video series had attracted nearly 50,000 subscribers, and he constantly sought out more dramatic locations to maintain viewer interest. When he arrived in Gansbaai in early August, he was specifically hunting for remote cliff diving spots that had not been filmed extensively. Local guides warned him about the shark activity, but Liam had researched the statistics. Fatal encounters were rare, and he reasoned that most attacks occurred near seal colonies or in murky water. He found his location on August 19th, an isolated cliff face about 8 kilometers south of the main harbor. The cliff rose approximately 40 feet above deep blue water, with no visible seal activity and excellent visibility. 3 friends accompanied him to film from multiple angles and provide safety support. Liam performed his standard safety check, studying the water for rocks, debris, or unusual currents. The surface appeared calm, the depth adequate. What he could not see was the thermocline 20 feet below, where colder water created a natural boundary that great whites often patrolled. He also could not know that a 17-foot female had been hunting in the area that morning, her last meal more than 36 hours earlier. He positioned himself at the cliff edge, checked that his friends were ready with their cameras, and launched into a clean dive. The entry was perfect, his body slicing through the surface with minimal splash. His waterproof camera captured the descent, the blue water darkening as he plunged deeper. The great white surged upward from below almost immediately. The shark had been cruising along the thermocline when the splash and the glint of Liam's camera equipment triggered its prey response. From the shark's perspective, the sudden surface disturbance matched the profile of a wounded seal or struggling prey animal. Liam was still submerged when the shark struck. The massive jaws clamped onto his torso with over 4,000 pounds of force, the serrated teeth tearing through his wetsuit and flesh. The impact drove him deeper, not toward the surface. The shark shook him violently, an instinctive behavior designed to incapacitate struggling prey. On the cliff above, Liam's friends initially thought he was simply taking longer than expected to surface. Then the water erupted in a mass of white spray and crimson. They began screaming, waving their arms frantically, though there was nothing they could do from their position. One friend immediately called emergency services while the others continued shouting, hoping somehow to distract the predator. The attack lasted approximately 15 seconds, though to the witnesses it seemed infinitely longer. The shark released Liam and circled once before disappearing back into deeper water. His body floated to the surface, the wounds catastrophic. The friends scrambled down a rocky path to reach the shoreline, but the descent took nearly 10 minutes. A local fishing boat had heard the screaming and altered course to investigate. The captain, who had fished these waters for 30 years, immediately understood what had happened when he saw the blood in the water. He and his crew pulled Liam's body from the ocean using gaffs and rope, knowing already that he was beyond help. Emergency services arrived 20 minutes later, but could only confirm what the fishing crew already knew. Liam Foster had died almost instantly from the injuries, his internal organs crushed and torn beyond survival. The waterproof camera was still strapped to his wrist, its footage ending abruptly at the moment of impact. The incident sent shockwaves through the extreme sports community. Cliff diving, generally considered safer than cage diving or surfing in terms of shark encounters, suddenly seemed far more dangerous. Marine biologists who examined the evidence noted that great whites regularly patrol deep water near cliff faces, and that the splash from a cliff diver could easily mimic the behavior of prey. Local authorities increased warning signage along remote coastal areas, and several extreme sports athletes canceled planned dives in the region. Liam's friends, traumatized by witnessing the attack and their inability to help, struggled with guilt and recurring nightmares for years afterward. The footage from his camera was never released publicly. The fjords of southern Chile had witnessed a dramatic increase in orca activity over the previous decade, with multiple pods establishing permanent territories in the narrow waterways. By June 2025, marine biologists had documented increasingly bold behavior from these intelligent predators, particularly in regions where fishing boats and tourist vessels had become commonplace. The cold waters near Puerto Aden, a remote settlement accessible only by boat, provided ideal hunting grounds for orcas pursuing seals and sea lions along the rocky coastline. Lara Mendez had saved for 3 years to purchase her small cruising vessel, a 30-foot fiberglass boat designed for coastal exploration. At 36, the Portuguese-born engineer had relocated to Chile specifically for access to the pristine southern waters. When her birthday arrived on June 8th, she organized a modest celebration with 4 close friends, planning a 2-day journey through the fjords to photograph icebergs and wildlife. The group departed Puerto Aden just after dawn, navigating carefully through the maze of channels and inlets. The weather was unusually calm for winter, with scattered icebergs drifting lazily in the current. Lara's friends, all experienced sailors, took turns at the helm while others prepared lunch below deck. By early afternoon, they had traveled approximately 40 kilometers from the settlement, surrounded by towering ice walls and absolute silence. The orcas appeared without warning. One moment, the water was empty. The next moment, 6 dorsal fins sliced through the surface in perfect formation. Lara recognized them immediately as adult males, their fins standing nearly 6 feet tall. She killed the engine, not wanting to disturb the pod, and her friends rushed to the rails with cameras. The first ram came from directly astern. The lead orca accelerated underwater and struck the hull with tremendous force, the impact throwing everyone off balance. One friend crashed into the cabin door, crying out in pain. Before anyone could react, the orca circled and struck again, this time targeting the stern where the rudder and propeller were located. Lara lunged for the radio, shouting their coordinates to the Coast Guard while the boat rocked violently from repeated impacts. A second orca joined the assault, ramming the port side with enough force to splinter the wooden railing. Waves surged over the gunwale, flooding the deck. One friend lost her footing and slid toward the edge before grabbing a cleat. The attacks were methodical and coordinated. While 2 orcas focused on the stern, others circled the bow, their massive bodies breaching partially out of the water before crashing down near the cabin. The sound was deafening, a combination of splintering fiberglass, rushing water, and the explosive breathing of the whales. Equipment was scattered across the deck, and the cooler containing their food broke loose and tumbled overboard. Lara tried restarting the engine, hoping movement might deter the pod, but the rudder had been damaged, and the propeller made grinding sounds. They were effectively disabled. Her friends grabbed oars from the emergency locker and attempted to fend off the orcas, striking the water and shouting. The whales seemed entirely unconcerned, continuing their assault with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. For nearly 10 minutes, the attack continued. One orca gripped the rudder in its jaws and shook it like a toy, tearing metal fixtures loose. Another repeatedly struck the hull beneath the waterline, each impact sending vibrations through the entire vessel. Lara felt certain they would capsize or sink. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault ended. The lead orca released the rudder and surfaced alongside the boat, its eye visible just above the waterline. It remained there for perhaps 30 seconds, seemingly observing the humans before diving and rejoining the pod. The 6 orcas swam away in formation, their fins disappearing into the gray water. Lara and her friends stood in shocked silence, surveying the damage. The stern was heavily damaged, with the railing destroyed and multiple sections of hull cracked or splintered. Water sloshed in the bilge, though the pumps were keeping pace. 2 friends had sustained injuries, one with a fractured arm from being thrown against the cabin and another with broken ribs from impact with the deck. The Coast Guard arrived 90 minutes later, towing the crippled vessel back to Puerto Aden. Medical personnel treated the injuries, none of which were life-threatening, but all of which required weeks of recovery. Lara's boat required extensive repairs that would take months and consume most of her savings. Marine experts who investigated the incident noted that orcas in the region had been exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior toward small vessels, possibly as exploratory play or a defensive response to perceived territorial intrusion. The animal's intelligence and strength made such encounters extremely dangerous, even when the whales had no apparent intention to kill. Lara eventually returned to the water, but never again ventured into the southern fjords during the winter months when orca activity peaked. The fjords of Greenland had remained among the least explored marine environments on Earth, their frigid waters and extreme depths deterring all but the most dedicated researchers. By November 2021, advances in submersible technology had finally made deep-water surveys feasible, though the conditions remained brutally challenging. The fjord system near Nuuk, the capital, plunged to depths exceeding 800 meters in places, creating pressure zones where specialized equipment was essential for survival. Greenland sharks, among the longest-lived vertebrates on the planet, inhabited these dark waters year-round, their slow metabolisms perfectly adapted to the near-freezing temperatures. Ingrid Sørensen had spent 12 years studying Arctic marine ecosystems, focusing primarily on deep-sea fish populations that science had barely documented. At 41, the Norwegian marine biologist had participated in expeditions from Svalbard to Iceland, but the Greenland fjords represented her most ambitious project yet. She had secured funding for a 3-week survey, using a compact 2-person submersible, though budget constraints meant she would be diving solo with surface support from a small research vessel. The project had faced numerous setbacks before Ingrid even entered the water. Equipment failures, weather delays, and bureaucratic complications with Greenlandic authorities had consumed the first week. Her research partner had been forced to return to Norway due to a family emergency, leaving Ingrid to conduct the dives alone. The pressure to produce results weighed heavily on her as the funding organization had made clear that future grants depended on this expedition's success. The submersible itself was a marvel of engineering, a titanium sphere equipped with flotation tanks, high-intensity lights, sample collection arms, and multiple cameras. Ingrid had completed dozens of dives in similar craft, descending to depths where sunlight never penetrated and pressure could crush unprotected humans instantly. She felt more comfortable in the submersible than most people felt in their own homes, though she remained acutely aware of the risks inherent in deep-water exploration. November 17th brought the clearest conditions the team had seen in 10 days. The surface remained choppy, with small icebergs drifting past the research vessel, but underwater visibility was reported as excellent. Ingrid planned to survey a section of the fjord wall between 400 and 600 meters in depth, documenting fish species and collecting water samples at various depths. Her surface crew consisted of 3 technicians and the vessel captain, all experienced in Arctic operations, but none qualified to pilot the submersible in an emergency. The descent took 40 minutes, the submersible dropping through progressively darker water as surface light faded to black. Ingrid monitored depth gauges and systems displays while occasionally glancing through the reinforced acrylic viewport. At 200 meters, the last traces of blue disappeared. At 400 meters, her lights became the only illumination in an absolute void. The isolation was profound, a silence broken only by the hum of motors and the occasional ping of the sonar system. She began her survey run, piloting the submersible slowly along the rocky fjord wall. Strange fish appeared in her lights, species she had never seen before, their bodies adapted to the crushing pressure and eternal darkness. She activated the cameras and sample collection arms, her movements practiced and efficient. The water temperature hovered at 1 degree Celsius, cold enough that any leak would be immediately fatal. Ice crystals occasionally drifted past the viewport, suspended in the dense water like frozen stars. The bait canister was standard procedure for deep-water surveys, a mesh container filled with fish parts designed to attract local fauna. Ingrid deployed it about 20 meters from the submersible, securing it to the rocky fjord wall with a magnetic clamp. Within minutes, smaller fish began investigating, their movements slow and deliberate in the frigid water. She documented several species, including one she suspected might be previously unrecorded. The Greenland shark appeared at the edge of her light range, a massive shadow that materialized from the absolute darkness. Ingrid estimated its length at over 16 feet, making it one of the largest specimens ever documented. The shark moved with glacial slowness, its body appearing to move yet covering distance with surprising efficiency. Its eyes were clouded with parasites, a common condition that left most Greenland sharks functionally blind, relying instead on smell and the detection of minute electrical fields. Ingrid increased the power to her external lights, hoping to document the creature's approach. The shark ignored the bait entirely, instead orienting toward the submersible itself. She realized with growing concern that the electrical hum of her motors and the vibrations from her ballast pumps were likely far more interesting to the predator than dead fish. Her hand moved instinctively to the emergency ascent controls, hovering there as she debated whether the threat was real or imagined. The collision came without warning. The shark's blunt snout struck the submersible's starboard side with tremendous force, the impact throwing Ingrid violently against her restraints. Alarms immediately sounded as pressure sensors registered the blow. The shark's rough skin, covered in tooth-like dermal denticles, scraped across the acrylic viewport with a horrible grinding sound, leaving deep scratches in material designed to withstand hundreds of atmospheres of pressure. Ingrid fought to stabilize the craft as it spun slowly from the impact. The shark circled back into view, its movement still languid but purposeful. It nudged the submersible again, this time from below, lifting the entire craft several meters. More alarms triggered. Ingrid's heart hammered as she checked for leaks or system failures, her hands moving across controls with practiced speed. The depth gauge fluctuated wildly as the submersible rocked from the impact. The shark made a third pass, its enormous body filling the viewport. Ingrid could see individual denticles on its skin, the parasitic copepods attached to its eyes, and the gill slits flexing as it breathed. The creature appeared ancient and alien, something from another world entirely. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of small, sharp teeth designed for tearing rather than crushing. She made the decision instantly. Ingrid dumped ballast weights and hit the emergency ascent button, flooding the tanks with compressed air. The submersible lurched upward, accelerating away from the fjord floor. Through the downward-facing viewport, she watched the shark grow smaller, still circling the spot where she had been moments before, apparently confused by the sudden departure of the vibrating object it had been investigating. The ascent took 35 minutes, each one feeling like an hour. Ingrid monitored the scratches on the viewport, praying they had not compromised structural integrity. At 100 meters, she could see sunlight filtering down from above. At 50 meters, she could make out the hull of the research vessel. She maintained radio contact with the surface crew, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She surfaced badly shaken, bruised from being thrown against her restraints but physically unharmed. The submersible bore deep scratches and several dents in the flotation tanks, damage that would require weeks of repairs and likely consume the remainder of her research budget. Ingrid's team helped her from the craft, concerned by her pale face and trembling hands. The captain immediately began documenting the damage, while one technician checked her for injuries. She filed her report that evening, noting that Greenland sharks, typically considered docile scavengers, could exhibit investigative behavior toward novel objects in their environment, particularly those generating unusual vibrations or electrical fields. The incident forced a premature end to the expedition, but her documentation of the encounter provided valuable data on a species of science still barely understood. The waters off Gansby, South Africa, had maintained their reputation as one of the most densely populated great white shark habitats in the world for generations. By February 2025, the region had become a focal point for marine research, with multiple organizations operating submersibles and underwater vehicles to study both the sharks themselves and the complex ecosystem that supported them. The continental shelf dropped away sharply just offshore, creating channels where cold, nutrient-rich water surged upward, attracting everything from plankton to apex predators. The area's notorious Shark Alley, a narrow passage between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock, remained a hunting ground where great whites ambushed seals with devastating efficiency. Tobias Kearney had worked as a marine engineer for 16 years, specializing in the maintenance and inspection of research submarines and remotely operated vehicles. At 39, the South African-born technician had developed a reputation for thoroughness and calm under pressure, traits that made him invaluable to research organizations operating expensive equipment in challenging conditions. His current contract involved a 3-month assignment with a marine biology institute, conducting behavioral studies of great whites using a small research submarine capable of diving to 200 meters. The submarine had been experiencing minor issues with its starboard thruster assembly, a problem Tobias had traced to a loose mounting bracket that required hands-on inspection and repair. The vessel's onboard diagnostics could identify the general location of the fault. Still, someone needed to physically examine the hull to determine the extent of the damage and whether repairs could be performed in the water or would require dry dock. Tobias had performed similar inspections dozens of times, though rarely in waters as notorious as Gansby. The morning of February 23rd arrived with excellent conditions. Visibility was reported at over 20 meters, unusual for the area where plankton blooms often clouded the water. The submarine was anchored at 40 meters of water, roughly 3 kilometers offshore, over a relatively flat section of the seabed covered in kelp forests. The research team had completed their morning dive, documenting shark behavior near a seal colony, and had returned the submarine to its anchored position for inspection. Tobias performed his standard pre-dive checks, testing his regulator, checking air pressure, and ensuring his tool belt was properly secured. His dive kit included a large wrench, various sized bolts, a waterproof inspection camera, and a cutting tool for removing fouled lines or debris. The support crew aboard the surface vessel consisted of a dive supervisor, a medical technician, and 2 research assistants who would monitor his progress via a tethered communication line. He entered the water from the stern platform, the cold Atlantic immediately penetrating his 7mm wetsuit. The temperature hovered around 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to be uncomfortable but manageable for the 30 to 40 minutes he expected the inspection to take. He descended along the submarine's anchor line, equalizing pressure in his ears as the surface receded above him. The submarine came into view at 15 meters, its white hull stark against the darker water below. Kelp fronds swayed in the gentle current, creating a forest of brown and gold that extended in all directions. Tobias had always found kelp forests beautiful in an alien way, though he remained aware that they limited visibility and could easily entangle equipment or divers. Small fish darted between the fronds, and he spotted several rock lobsters clinging to the submarine's hull, taking advantage of the artificial reef it created. He reached the starboard side and began his inspection, running his gloved hand along the thruster housing. The mounting bracket was indeed loose, with 2 of its 4 bolts missing entirely, and a third showing significant corrosion. The damage was minor but would worsen quickly if not addressed. Tobias retrieved his wrench and began working on the corroded bolt, applying steady pressure to break it free without stripping the threads. The submarine's auxiliary systems were still active, maintaining ballast and running diagnostics even while anchored. This created a constant low-frequency hum that vibrated through the water, a sound Tobias had learned to tune out during previous inspections. What he did not know was that this particular frequency could travel surprising distances underwater, and that great whites possessed extraordinary sensitivity to such vibrations, often investigating unusual sounds from hundreds of meters away. The shark emerged from the kelp forest without warning, appearing suddenly at the edge of Tobias's vision. He turned his head and found himself looking at a massive great white, easily 17 feet long, its body thick and muscular. The shark was female, her girth suggesting a mature animal that had likely been hunting these waters for decades. Her black eye tracked him with what appeared to be curiosity, rather than immediate aggression. Tobias froze, his training overriding his instinct to flee. Sudden movements could trigger a predatory response. He maintained eye contact with the shark, slowly rotating his body to keep her in view. The wrench remained in his hand, though he doubted it would provide much defense if the shark decided to attack. His heart rate spiked, and he forced himself to breathe slowly and steadily through his regulator. The shark circled once, her movements economical and purposeful. She was investigating, trying to determine what he was and whether he represented food or threat. Tobias pressed himself against the submarine's hull, trying to minimize his profile. The kelp swayed around them, creating shifting shadows that made tracking the shark's position increasingly difficult. The first ram came from directly ahead. The shark accelerated suddenly, covering the distance in less than 2 seconds, and struck the submarine's hull with her snout. The impact sent a shuddering vibration through the metal that Tobias felt in his chest. The force of the collision threw him sideways, his shoulder slamming against a protruding sensor array. Pain shot through his arm, but he maintained his grip on the wrench. The shark banked sharply and came around for a second pass. This time she angled lower, targeting Tobias directly rather than the submarine. Her snout grazed his shoulder and upper arm, her rough skin tearing through the neoprene wetsuit like sandpaper against cloth. Tobias felt immediate burning pain as the dermal denticles ripped into his flesh, opening deep lacerations that began bleeding profusely into the water. He reacted instinctively, jabbing the wrench toward the shark's snout while kicking hard with his fins. The wrench struck something solid, possibly her nose or eye area, and the shark veered away. Blood clouded the water around Tobias, dark and ominous against the lighter background. He knew the blood would only increase the shark's interest, potentially attracting other predators. The shark circled wider now, her movements suggesting heightened arousal. She was no longer simply investigating. The blood in the water, the thrashing movements, and the unusual vibrations from the submarine had triggered something more dangerous. Tobias could see her body language change, with her pectoral fins dropping slightly and her back arching. She made another pass, closer this time, her jaws opening to reveal rows of triangular teeth. Tobias pressed himself flat against the hull, making himself as small as possible. The shark's head turned at the last moment, her teeth snapping closed inches from his torso. He could feel the pressure wave from her body as she swept past. For 5 agonizing minutes, the pattern continued. The shark would circle, make aggressive passes, and Tobias would defend himself with the wrench while trying to work his way around the submarine toward the anchor line. His arm throbbed with pain and he could feel blood streaming from the lacerations. His air supply was adequate, but his heart rate was consuming oxygen faster than normal. The surface crew, monitoring his vital signs and aware that something was wrong from his erratic movements, had already launched a rescue protocol. A second diver entered the water with a shark shield, an electronic device that created an electromagnetic field theoretically capable of deterring sharks. The device activated as the diver descended, sending pulses through the water. The great white hesitated, her circle widening. She made one more pass, slower this time, before turning away and disappearing back into the kelp forest. Whether the electromagnetic field had influenced her decision or whether she had simply lost interest remained unclear. Tobias seized the opportunity, kicking hard toward the anchor line. The rescue diver met him halfway, took his arm, and guided him upward. They ascended carefully, maintaining proper speed to avoid decompression issues despite the desperate urge to reach the surface immediately. Breaking into sunlight and air felt like resurrection. Hands grabbed Tobias from the water, hauling him onto the dive platform. The medical technician immediately began treating his injuries, cutting away the torn wetsuit to reveal deep lacerations along his shoulder and upper arm. The wounds were serious but not life-threatening, the shark's rough skin having caused more damage than her teeth. Deep bruising was already forming along his ribcage where he had been slammed against the submarine. The support crew radioed for a helicopter medical evacuation while applying pressure bandages and administering pain medication. Tobias lay on the deck, shaking from adrenaline and cold, his mind replaying those 5 minutes in stark detail. The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, transporting him to a trauma center in Cape Town, where surgeons cleaned and sutured the lacerations. He spent 4 days in the hospital recovering from the wounds and monitoring for infection. The physical injuries healed within weeks, though he carried prominent scars on his shoulder and arm. The psychological impact proved more persistent. Tobias completed his contract with the Research Institute but declined future assignments involving in-water inspections in known shark habitats. Marine experts who reviewed the incident noted that the combination of underwater machinery vibrations, the confined space created by the kelp forest, and Tobias's presence had made an unusually provocative scenario. Great whites investigating unusual stimuli could quickly escalate into aggressive behavior, particularly in areas where they regularly hunt and feel territorial. The incident reinforced existing protocols for hull inspections in high-risk areas, prompting many organizations to require shark spotters and additional safety divers for similar operations.